Thanks for everyone who dialed in and for the people who will crawl in here shortly. I want to give a short introduction to myself and also kind of describe how this call came to be. Then we'll give an opportunity for our speakers to kind of introduce themselves and we'll get into the meat of the matter. My name is Justice. I go by ZeroX Justice in the DAO space and Singularity Hack on Twitter. I work at Polygon Labs as a part of a new DAO team, and we're trying to do the DAO stuff with a different flavor, right? A more kind of rigor and business oriented. And, if that doesn't sound cool, let's do it in a way that is cool and exciting, right? And how this call came to be was there's a paper called Games Over Governance. And the idea was I got kind of tired of the standard governance philosophical discussions. And I thought, well, what if we kind of go back to the beginning and it's more like a game design and it's less about making decisions on things and more about knowing the rules of the game and then rewarding people for doing things that you want them to do. And I made some janky Machinations models, and we'll get into what Machinations is. And I thought, well, they're okay. It's a start, but it's really not the polish. It's not the polish I'd like. So I reached out to my friend Rabbit, who I discovered because he had kind of a lot of activity in the Machinations kind of ecosystem, and also his rabbit face sticks in your mind. You see him on Twitter, LinkedIn, and stuff. And so I said, hey man, can you pimp my models to a next level? And what he brought back to me was something so far beyond what I even realized the tool is capable of doing. I thought, man, I think we're onto something. And I'll talk about it like a new kind of science, as it were. And so I'll leave with this, that there was a time when people thought that there wasn't a direct correlation between algebra, mathematics, and geometry. And Rene Descartes came along and showed that there was a correspondence. There's a correlation. He combined the two sciences. And then in a similar way, many years later, there's something called the Curry-Howard isomorphism, which basically shows that there's a formal proof that says that every math proof is also a program, and every program can be converted to a math proof. So it shows that they're equivalent. And then, this reference to a new kind of science many years ago, there's an author, Stephen Wolfram. He wrote a book called Cellular Automata, which is basically a way that you make very simple rules, and these rules kind of interact in a way like the game of life is the classic example, and produces something unimaginably more complex. And so I can't prove it. I don't know it, but my spidey sense tells me there's something deep about the connection between DAOs, DAO governance, and this rigorous kind of modeling of token engineering. So that's how this call came to be. So that's a bit about me and the story here. Let's go a round of short introductions from everyone and just say, who are you, what are you doing, and how you got here? You want to kick us off, Deacon?
Sure. Hi, I'm Deacon from DAO House. We build DAO tooling and DAO protocol and build and maintain the open source protocol, basically. We really want to see DAOs work, and we play with them all the time in different ways. And so it's really interesting to start thinking of these things more like games. And it's interesting because Machinations is something I was playing with a couple years ago. And it's cool to see it kind of coming back in a way that may help us model some of these things.
Awesome, thank you. Rabbit, give us a shout out.
What's up, guys? I am a curious rabbit building up my own little rabbit dynasty. I'm actually just working in the space, helping projects design their token systems, and also kind of uncovering the elements that we should be considering when designing token systems, right? Because this is such a new design space. So I'm building in the space, but I also feel like I'm learning as I'm going. And we use Machinations all the time. I use Machinations sometimes to prep for meetings, because if I get a white paper with, let's say, complex formal definitions, when I start to actually visualize them in Machinations, I show up to the meeting understanding what the client is trying to build much more than if I just read through a document that's hard for my mind to process. So yeah, I met Justice, and I love the idea because governance within DAOs has always been a sticky point. I'm sure all of us have wasted hours sitting on, meetings discussing things when we would have loved to have been doing things. And I hope that we can find a balance here between designing these protocols as games and abstracting away a bit of that governance.
Thanks, Rabbit. I know when you said hours, many people on the call thought weeks, months. Okay, next up, Alex. I believe we have Alex behind the Machinations handle.
Yes. So, hi everyone. I'm Alex, and as you can probably hear, I'm French. I joined Machination a little bit more than 1 year ago, and I manage the communities and content there. And yeah, I also want to say that I'm beside having a passion for marketing, I'm a big gamer, and that's really what excited me to join Machination. And when I will explain later what you can do with Machination, you will probably understand my interest for it. But yes, and thanks again for the invitation.
Awesome. Thank you for accepting. And then we have Nicholas, another one for Machinations, right?
Yeah. Hello. How are you? How is everyone? Yeah, I'm Nicolas. I've been working for Machinations for over a year, and I'm a game designer. And I've been working since I started on Web3 projects, and mostly modeling like the actual application that we found in that ecosystem was to simulate and visualize what an actual player, or what we call a single player model, what a player does when they interact with the game, and also how the interactions between one player and the game and all of the other players can affect the ecosystem. And that's what we call sometimes a multiplayer model. And we try to simulate the tokenomic strategy, and in that way we try to assess risks and to make predictions. So yeah, I'm very excited to be in this space. So thank you for inviting me.
Cool. Yeah. And for people, I think probably the best way to get started is just, Alex, if you want to talk about like, where did Machinations come from? Kind of what is it? Some context. This is a purely audio medium. And so, we'll want to be descriptive there.
Yes.
And then after you kind of get into that, I'd like to circle back to Deacon and talk about what are coordination games, because, we're going to get into stuff that you just, I haven't heard from any other party as far as the depth of how deep like governance and coordination games go. So the secret sauce is connecting these two. So pretty excited.
Yeah, sure. And as you said, so it's only audio right now, but yeah, Machination is a visual framework. So I will do my best to describe it. But yes, so Machination is a web-based platform for designing, simulating, and predicting game economies and systems. And I will go back a little bit in time and to explain very briefly the origin of the tool. So the tool was created by Joris Mans, who is a Dutch game designer, and he was working on PhD at that time. And I guess he was a bit frustrated himself because he was trying to find a quick way to prototype and communicate about game mechanics. And game mechanics in particularly are kind of hard to design, and because they are difficult to visualize and difficult to simulate quickly. So Joris Dorman came with this idea to create a visual framework that allows designer with no programming experience to diagram and to simulate them in that tool. So basically, his idea is to equip game designer with a universal language, that you can use to prototype and simulate any game mechanic and systems. And it happens that because it's a Turing complete language, you can basically model anything you can think about with that tool. If if that's clear for everybody.
Yeah, yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, so now Deacon, what are coordination games?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's pretty broad, right? And so,
Right.
I mean, even just the term DAO, is, decentralized autonomous organizations, is pretty broad. It can range from something fairly kind of automatic, maybe, managing cryptocurrency and a fee that isn't a swap through the users of that swap and their governance, kind of a democratic governance. But it can also be more on the social side. Like we're seeing these organizations start up that are based DAOs or product based DAOs or venture investment kind of DAOs. But one of the things that they have in common is, and on the social side, is that there's a lot of governance that happens, and there's like kind of consensus based governance. But I think what we've kind of seen is that if there isn't a small kind of framework, even if it's not even at like the token modeling stage, something that is just about like how do you interact with everyone else in this organization, it makes things flow a little easier because people know what to expect. So once we start like thinking of that more as a game, then it makes governance kind of fun again, right? And it could mean a lot of different things on how the tokens are set up, or NFTs, or one token, or like multiple token models. And what's cool about something like Machinations is like when designing a game, you have maybe an in-game currency. And so like an in-game currency to a DAO may be its governance token. And so if you can think about it in the same way that you think about in game design, where you have questions of balance and questions of like feedback loops and things like that, you can start building something that is more engaging to all the members, more inclusive, and really ultimately more fair and fun, the important part. So, it really ranges from like how prescriptive these rules are, because the DAO is very kind of dynamic and flexible, and people can kind of change the game. A lot of times these coordination games are kind of a meta game that is evolving over time. But setting up an initial kind of rails for people to wrap their head around and understand the game they are playing, understand that they're in a game, is kind of the first step, I guess.
Yeah, that's good. One thing that's pointed out too in that games over governance is not just about one game, it's about a chain of games or game of games. Like you talk about the meta governance, and there's implicit in there that the organization has the ability to change the games over time. And so, yeah, and just for context for everyone else, like if for people who may be more used to just seeing token, Discord, snapshot, yes, no type stuff, DAO House is basically their kind of framework revolves around Moloch DAO, which has like so much more complexity. There's two classes of shares, there's rage quit, and so just it's kind of going from a jacks to a Rubik's cube. So the possibility of how you design the games around that, it kind of opens up and creates kind of interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's really when DAOs get interesting, is when we start putting things on chain. When they're on chain, one result can affect an outcome, or one outcome can affect a result in something else. And so you may have one vote that is more like a multi-choice kind of signal weighted thing that may result how some tokens are distributed to the community, which results in more power for them to vote in another thing. And so you start unlocking these superpowers, but there's also a lot of constraints as well, because it is on chain and it can feel a little complex. That's why I think creating these kind of frameworks are important in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Deacon, one last thing for you before I move over to Rabbit. Because sometimes I can't prove that there's a deep connection between token engineering and what we think of as when it goes into that, and governance. And I think maybe to some people they're like, well, they're different. One's kind of volitional, one's human, and the other is the machine. But sometimes I'm like, no, there's a deep thing here. And I even have been challenged. I've felt challenged in trying to model it because I think, well, in one sense, this movement of a resource in the Machinations model represents money. And then in another sense, it actually represents decision. Do you feel a similar tension, or where do you sit with that kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely a similar tension. Sometimes, so recently we've been talking about this model called FOG, the flywheel of governance, and kind of a reference to the fog of war and strategy RPGs. But
That is already so cool.
when I shared that with people, they were like, "Well, yeah, it's interesting, but this isn't a game." I mean, it's kind of a stretch to say that this is something like fun and that I'd want to play, but there is something there, and even in that kind of that acronym of FOG as it relates to the fog of war, when we have a decentralized group all trying to find consensus or trying to make a decision together, it's kind of like we're in the dark forest. You know, we're in this giant map where we can't see what's out there. So if you have these different layers of meta governance, you start unlocking and start seeing things. You start seeing the map a little better, and that can help with decision making going forward.
Yeah, that's good, and I think sometimes maybe the seriousness of it can be lost with the word game, but I think it does. I use the term game just to mean a model, right, with a positive associations, right? Rabbit, you mentioned using machinations and kind of modeling rather than arriving at a conclusion, but to improve your thinking. You said in preparation for something, and I wonder in the same way, like, regardless if there's a deep isomorphism between governance and token engineering and this rigorous modeling, maybe just the act of attempting to model creates some clarity. Also along with that, some people probably listening to us, or I know the first time I saw Machinations, I thought, man, I'm going to need like 2 weeks off of work and studying to pick this thing up. And maybe some encouragement to people who are like, it sounds a little too complex about picking it up and kind of learning it, because you're an individual who's done that very thing.
Sure. First, the learning curve for Machinations, super short. Let's say it's about 4 hours before you understand most of the features of the platform and how to use them. And then practice is what gets you good at them. Now, it's a bit like drawing, not that I'm a drawer, but there were moments in my life where I was like, well, let's try drawing. And it's like you just start, you draw simple shapes, right? And the more you draw simple shapes, you get better at drawing those simple shapes. And then instead of a square, it becomes a door, right? And it has a bit more features, that square. It's very similar in Machinations. You start with very simple diagrams, very simple core loops, and you play around. The way I really found, so I used Machinations to learn out loud. So I would come across interesting Web3 crypto economic primitives, and I would try to design them in Machinations. What that did for me is just like I was curious about something. I had a tool that I could visualize it in, and I learned the tool by trying to visualize. So I found that to be super helpful. To refer back to FOG and let's say the multi-shareholder model and the other features of DAO House and Mullet DAO, this is like a great example of what you could use Machinations for. So I have a client right now, and one of the elements we're discussing is actually building a playbook for how to use his protocol, because the protocol could be used in many different ways, but if people don't know how to use those ways, then it might not get leveraged as much as it could. And I can imagine something similar for Mullet DAO. So you have all of these features and all these elements, and you could create a simple model of how they all connect together. And then you could go and you can create a variation of different playbooks, or a playbook of different variations of how these different features could actually talk to each other to create, let's say, a different kind of coordination game. And that would be something super helpful and useful to do in Machinations.
Man, that's so good. It kind of reminds me of what's Swagger, the API documentation, where it's like it's not really prescriptive, it's more descriptive on what you can do in examples, interactive. And then one thing that I think is, regardless if we solve the universe P versus NP and bring in the singularity, right, just being able to have replicatable patterns kind of creates additive. If every single time you have to build your own, engine, and not as many people are going to have cars. But as soon as you kind of get a mass production or ability to be able to reference certain design patterns and copy and paste different things, I mean, we've seen the pattern of, multi-sigs and sub-DAOs and grants committees kind of imitated across the whole ecosystem once one person starts doing it. So in a similar way, if we get like a playbook of patterns, then you can kind of have an additive build on the shoulder of the last person type stuff,
Yeah, that's an awesome point. It's kind of like there's too much flexibility sometimes. So putting some ground rules for the game, like if everyone showed up into an auditorium, like 100 people, and they all had a purpose, there's no direction initially to get them working together and coordinating together towards that purpose. One guy might start just running around screaming, one person's dancing, but if there's some like really basic ground rules, so when you walk in the door, you're like, oh, okay, so this is the next step, and this is how I do something, and this is where I go, and these are how these tokens work. It's just like setting up the game board. There's a community member in DAO House, UI369, who's actually listening. He does a lot of really interesting things with Machinations and a lot of thinking around, this, like, what is a game, really, and things like that.
Ooh, please give a holler, man. I think I invited you to be a speaker, and you have a deep background in Agile stuff too as well, right? Let's see, make sure. I resent it just in case.
So the original tool, like Machinations, they talk a lot about it in the form of designing your systems and then performing Monte Carlo simulations. Sorry, which is something that we may get into later. But one of the really unexplored utilities of it is communication, which is something that we've touched on in this talk. Being able to communicate to, let's say, your new members of the DAO, the structure of the DAO, in a visual manner that shows them can be priceless to facilitating the onboarding process, which we all know is a pain in the ass.
Yeah, that's good. We got some treats. We got 3 models that Machinations has kindly decided to share with us, which we can talk through here in a minute. And Universal, I think you're on now. You want to share any thoughts or observations you've had thus far?
Yeah, I think that what Deacon just said kind of sums it up, where when you enter a new space with people, there's just implied chaos, where anybody could do anything. And in a DAO, that's kind of the default state. I like to compare it to a board game. If you get your friends together and sit down at a board game, you've kind of, at the very least, agreed to open the box and read the instructions. And it breaks it down into these discrete actions that you have available to you. Like you might have 5 or 6 moves that you can do on your turn. And so governance, I use the game metaphor like mad. We've got a new DAO we're putting together that serves other DAOs, and it's called DAO Masons. So we're kind of building DAOs, and we use the game metaphor all over the place in our own docs and otherwise. I think it really helps break things into bite-sized chunks, like people have a lever to pull rather than a pile of gears where they have to build the whole machine every time.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay, guys, let's talk through some of these models. Is it okay if I share the onboarding model that you guys made?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to share it as a reply in this very announcement of the spaces. And we may not be able to assume that everyone can see it because a lot of people are on mobile and stuff, but maybe just a description on, because this is not just a theoretical model, this is actually what you guys use for client onboarding, and maybe a little context too of like, what does it mean by client? Because you guys have a whole kind of a validation or verification that you do with people when they come to you as a kind of consulting, right?
Yes, that's correct. So the model you are sharing is our onboarding flow for the Web3 game we have partnered with. So we've talked a bit about how Machination is used by game designer yet to model their game system. And there is another aspect to it, is that, we can run simulation using Machination. We can use simulation and try to predict the outcome of a set of parameters, right? And the purpose of running simulation for a game designer is also to balance their game. So we want to make sure that, I don't know, my marketplace, for instance, work correctly, that there is not too much grinding, etc., etc. And it happens that regarding Web3 games, because also we are talking about real money there, but it's very important for those games that the economy is well balanced, so that there is not too much inflation or deflation. So we've launched a program also where we onboard with a partner, and we translate their game document into those models, and then we go through a set of simulation, and we check how the economy behave over time, and how the economy behave we simulate also players, and we check how the economy behave with once everything is in place. And that's the onboarding flow that you're sharing there. So it's a very basic onboarding flow, but it's just showing, at which step, with the client, but if the client will pass these steps, if not, we go back to previous steps, etc. So we have a pre-launch onboarding flow on the left column, and on the right, it's once we have validated the model, and then the economy of the project goes into production, and we keep reiterating and testing the model, and we meet with the client every week, and then there is the different thing that can happen. So if we detect that there is some kind of flaw in the model, we trigger an alert, or if the client decided to tweak his economy or to make some change, then we go back and to retest the model and see how the model behaves.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I mean, I think the first time I heard more in depth about Machinations, it was at the last MCon, and it was someone speaking from, I think it's an on-chain game called the Citadel, and they received kind of I guess you would say, an economic audit from you guys. I think it was the first game that you guys kind of put your stamp on to say, hey, given these constraints, there's no bugs or whatever, right? And for our listeners too, maybe listening a little later, what exactly is a Monte Carlo simulation? And the idea with that is, you can never know who's going to win a baseball game, but you do know the statistical spread of each player. You know how often one person gets hit with the ball or hits a home run, or how many times they go to second base and not just first. You have the statistics, and so you can run a simulation within the constraints of those statistics, and then another simulation with a slightly different statistics, but still within that same spread. And so with the power of computers, you can run a bazillion simulations and know what's the general a good strategy as far as player position, or also kind of the statistical likelihood of winning a game between two teams. And this was actually the birth of sabermetrics and kind of rigorous analysis of baseball. And so also for people who may be interacting with these models for the first time, the two things you want to look at is there's a play and a step button. If you hit play, it'll just run. Every cycle, it'll kind of do the thing it's supposed to do. If you hit step, it'll just do one cycle at a time. And so you can kind of go slower and just click it and see what happens and click it. And as Rabbit said, you can pick up on what some of these things mean as far as the sinks, the resource producers, and then something that kind of does a statistical probability spread, So definitely encourage you to check out that model. You can see, it goes from like the client signs a contract to immediately start simulating what they have, and then going through the onboarding process of the kickoff call, validate core game loops, And then when both of those are through, come through on the monitoring phase. And there is one really interesting property too that's fairly newer. I don't know if either Alex or Nicholas want to talk about, where you can have a real-time kind of data feeds coming into your model. Is this too new? Am I giving away the alpha here too much, or can you guys talk about this?
It's not new, but please, Nicolas, you can explain this part.
Yeah, it's kind of new. Yeah, I think it's been
Yeah,
for
last October,
a month.
maybe November. I don't remember, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's in November or December, I think. And yeah, you can use, for example, for live market feeds. For example, I think I've used it in one of my projects to get the actual conversion from or exchange rate between Ethereum and USDC, because I had to model a sort of AMM, and I wanted to know the price of a token from a project in USDC or in cents. So I had to get that conversion, but it was either okay, you can look for the price and sort of hard code it every time that you need to run a simulation, or you can just use a custom variable, because this feature is actually from custom variables, and you can just update the data and you'll get the latest version. You can also use it with JSON, and there are going to be some new features upcoming. I'm also waiting for because we need them. But for example, you can use it you have a JSON file uploaded in your server with data, and you can access any sub item, and you get the data and you feed that into the model. So that's a good thing, not to avoid sort of hard coding or adding actual values into the diagram, and then you want to modify them and you say, oh, I have to look and I have to remember where I put them in. So this is a better way, like a huge enhancement, I think.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah. And I mean, combined with the Monte Carlo simulations and being able to simulate millions of billions of scenarios, having that in one hand and then having real data feeds in the other, it's pretty incredible. The other model I wanted to bring up is the one that you made, Rabbit, and it was basically modeling, I believe this is kind of a DAO onboarding flow.
Yeah, this was. Can you guys hear me? Just want to make sure.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Yeah, this was just, I don't know, my way of illustrating some sort of logic flow within Machinations that could be pertinent to a DAO. So we all know the DAO Friends with Benefits, and so I made this little joke here about a guy who is looking for a job in Web3, and he wants to be part of this club called Benefits with Friends, and so he rents an NFT that gives him access to this DAO, which holds these networking events. And then there's a certain sort of probability associated with whether or not he makes successful connections or not. If he goes through many experiences of not making successful social connections, at some point he loses motivation and he leaves. And the other part is, if he does achieve making a certain number of social connections, then he may even get opportunities for a job of some kind. Now, during the whole process, he is earning these tokens for every attempt at a social connection that he makes. The only caveat being that if he gives up in the end, then he loses all of the rewards that he had accumulated so far. It's just a very simple logic flow, right?
This is a game. This is a game. There's an upside, there's a downside, there's a strategy. This is the type of stuff that makes me smile. This is great.
And Rabbit, you did a great job at illustrating the model, because it also looks good.
Yeah, thanks. And this is one of the core components that I think. So when we use Machinations in modeling, sometimes we're not even using it so much for the quantitative measurements that it's providing, as much as the overall perspective that it's providing. And once again, I just find that ability to communicate visually using Machinations, whether it's an onboarding flow, the game, the coordination game, how all the components of your DAO are functioning together, it can just really help get people aligned.
Are these shared somewhere? Could I lay
Oh
eyes
yeah,
on that one?
yep. They're shared right underneath the announcement of this Spaces, right underneath.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Last but not least, this one will definitely require some explanation. I believe, Nicholas, this is yours. Ratings and rewards system.
Yes, I'll try to keep it as simplified as possible. And this is actually an implementation of the Glico system. It's a very simplified way of looking at the Glico system. This is used especially for multiplayer, for matchmaking, and it's used in games such as Pokemon Go or Counter-Strike Global Offensive. And you can just use the system to see, okay, this player has this level or this rating, and depending on a certain confidence, we know that this player can be matched against, can play with other players, and they can be matched against some other players or some other teams, depending on their level and their engagement. So this is an actual application from games, but right now this is applied to, let's say we have a DAO and they want to connect clients with providers, and each client has a set rating or a level. They might be assessed initially, and for example, to the right of the model, you have a client that has a rating of 800. So the system will try to match that client or to connect it with service providers that have a rating that it's with a certain interval that includes that client. So this will depend on how good or bad the provider is. So what the actual model does is a provider, each month they accept proposals, and depending on these proposals, if they succeed or not, that will affect their rating. And the more engaged they are, the better, because that will reduce another factor that's called the ratings deviation. So the more engaged they are, then the system can believe or can trust that they actually have a certain rating, and it will be more efficient to say, I believe that this provider will be useful for this client. So the model what actually does is, as along 1 year or 2 years or so, a certain provider is working and they either succeed or fail, and depending on this, 1 or 2 clients can be connected to that provider. If the more they succeed, the better clients they will get. But this will vary depending on how hard it is, how hard the proposals are. So and additionally, they get rewards, and this is I've added sort of monthly rewards, and depending on how many proposals they have achieved or fulfilled successfully, they will have a certain tier. They will have like a multiplier, and this is sort of applied to many games. If there are, in this case, if you have more than 2 proposals, then you might have 10% more rewards per month, and that can be completely customized and applied to any DAO or any sort of selection of suppliers or providers.
I've heard, I think Elon Musk has said this, that the strangest outcome is the most probable. And I wonder if, we spent thousands of years trying to be very serious in how we model economies and all this, and yet game designers are actually, unbeknownst to us, the actual designers of our future, because we begin to take these models that have been perfected and thought through on a game level. It's similar to the birth of game theory, with a bunch of mathematicians and logicians sitting around playing card games and saying, I wonder if the loser in this game actually gets nuked. And so how does that change the stakes? And that gives rise to an entire new, field like that. So this is amazing. I wonder, are there any questions from anyone who's not a speaker? Feel free to raise your hand. But in the meantime, two things I want to bring up is one is I'll have kind of a around the table question, but before that, one thing that makes this very exciting to me beyond just the, hey, we wrote a paper, did some modeling, and this is fun, this is cool, this is the future, is the possibility of actually applying many of these things. Now, I work for Polygon Labs. I've been there for less than 2 months, but we're reviving something called Village, in which early stage projects will come through to get mentorship, incubation, oversight, kind of help in growing and all this. And so the ability to introduce these concepts earlier has a greater, impact on how they can succeed and how they can do this. And so this is one thing that's happening right now. Marco's on the line right now. He's head of DAOs at Polygon. And so to actually put teeth on this thing and figure out how to apply it and help people is very exciting. And so my kind of round the table question is what does this look like 5 years from now? No matter how far in the future I get, I'm always like, but what's beyond? Right? So Deacon, you want to kick us off? Tell us, man, what is 5 years from now as far as this modeling economies, like businesses that are look more like games and reputation, all this crazy stuff?
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about this in DAO House too. And one of the things that I think could be really interesting when we start doing a little more kind of open and transparent modeling and working together on these things is we see tons of different experiments in DAOs and using in different ways. But a lot of times it's kind of like a black box when you first get started and you're experimenting on, or you're kind of rebuilding the wheel. So I think what could be really cool over time is as people are doing more experiments and finding things that work, someone takes a piece of one person's things, takes a piece of another person's thing and makes a fork, right? And then they do another experiment. I mean, we're so early with this stuff that now's the time to just do a ton of experiments, see what works, narrow down on that, and then continue iterating. And just like an open source model of forking, I think could be really interesting. And so in 5 years from now, we find some really interesting models that people have kind of bought into and are then just pushing it even further.
That is amazing. I wonder, there's somebody who's going to listen to this recording, who's listening right now. Please, there's copious amounts of documentation out there that document every form and category of business model. Feel free to translate these into tokenized, self-sovereign identity, reputation, and make them models. And maybe we get some retroactive funding on you for such a thing. So. Okay, next around the table, where are we at 5 years from now?
I'll go. I like living in the future. It's really hard living in the present, honestly. Sorry, I guess that was like a joke for meditators.
Yeah.
So what's it like living in the future? In my mind, gamification is a trend that will only pick up and accelerate over time. So the trend of gamification is going to accelerate. So the rate of change at which things become gamified is only going to increase. And that's really facilitated by the digitization of the world and the merging of kind of the physical and the digital reality. And that comes because of a plethora of technologies that are emerging simultaneously. That's like IoT and ubiquitous internet and all sorts of things like that, and AI that's helping to merge the physical world to the digital world. And then you have stuff like VR and AR and all that sort of, and the improvement of those technologies that increase our immersion or experience of the digital world as though it's physical. And so you have this real merging of both realities. And then the bedrock of it all is actually going to be blockchain, which provides ownership, provenance, immutability, whether it's physical or digital, all to the same standard. So there's like this interconnecting layer that everything is built off of that provides ownership and financial transactions and Yeah, so I see these worlds merging. I see the base layer being blockchain and other technologies like that. And I see gamification increasing. I would like to believe that decentralization increases, although I can clearly see a tendency for the incumbent industries or people in power to try to avoid that or maintain a certain level of control. So I don't really know where that's going to go. But I do believe that in terms of business models, we will continue to see increasing number of business models that reward users and participants much more than before, like loyalty points on steroids. I'll stop there because I guess I could just keep rambling.
Amazing. I love it. You know, it makes me think too that what is the saying? I probably heard it from the Dow House guys. Is if you make a game, don't be mad when it's gamified or gamed, right? So you gotta take both. But I guess if you design a game where no matter how you play it, it's beneficial. There's a beneficial feedback loop, then you get awesome stuff. And luckily, we're not at the nation state level, network state. We're still at the experimentation stage, and so the exit and fork is an option. And we say we're early. Good thing we're early because we've done busted up some stuff too much by now. So, all right, next up on the question: 5 years from now.
Yes, I can answer. I'm more. Can you hear me still? Hello?
Yep.
Sorry. No,
Yeah.
disconnected. Yeah. So from my perspective, I don't know. I'm especially thinking about AI right now. And I'm telling you that because I work as a marketer, but I already see how it's changing my way of working. So, and especially I'm looking also at Machination and the tool. So I'm just more. I will just answer like how Machination could look like in 5 years, and I believe that it will happen before, but it's probably in few years. In few years, we will be able to design any model helped by an AI, and this AI will also, look at that all the model out there, learn from there, and help you to make better model and probably guide you in your decision. So yeah, I really believe that it's going to change the way we work.
Man, that's amazing. Maybe that's too far in the future. Now I'm nervous, right? Because you see,
Yes.
Sorry, can I make a comment about Machinations in the future? Just because we did want to talk about Machinations, and I do. So, like in crypto, right? We're not in crypto for where it is right now, but for what it can become. And honestly, that's my approach with Machinations. I use it now. I love it now, but I'm much more interested in what it may become when I can automatically feed live data from the systems that I'm monitoring and see how it interacts and projects things like in real time. So I really do see the features of Machinations expanding to tailor like these kind of token systems that we're building much more as more and more features arise. So I'm personally really excited for that.
Yeah. I feel like if we go back to all the way Ocean Protocol founder Trent McGonaffey, I always don't know how to say his last name, but Mantis clones in the crowd. He knows his writings well, but he mentions that it seems like the last kind of iteration on the whole game loop design is machine learning, and like where does that take us? So that's amazing and kind of hard to imagine. All right, Nick, did you speak to 5 years in the future?
Oh, I can think about like a year.
I know, right?
It's dizzying. Like, I mean, I'm a huge game nerd, and I believe that still we've come a long way, but still games aren't seen as something. Maybe I look at them in a serious way, in a complex way. I believe that games are complex systems, and there are ways to. I don't know. We have simulators. We have like goat simulator, or a or bus or school bus driving simulators that can actually be seen as something like real. And I think in the future, like gamifying processes can be used as a way of saying, we are bored of processes. I've worked in companies and I was so bored with processes and the way that they did things. And I think gamifying is a way of like putting down to earth and say, hey, we can just do this in a more efficient, quick way, and we can all get together and think about this in a game rather than in actual structured set of steps and procedures and I don't know, charts. And I think that in the future we are, even with tools like Machinations, we can see, we can try to put these processes. I see Machinations not only as a tool for games, but for everything, like this, what Daniel or what Alex did, like Rabbit. They're just, we are showing a workflow. We are showing a workflow in a way that it's not like a squares and something that you do in a sheet, in a doc, and you can show that to any person, to anyone. I even showed my mom one day how to use a tool, and I showed them, okay, you can see here expenses and where you have money and you pay taxes, and she understood the tool, she got it. And I think that you can show that at schools everywhere, and if they understand how to gamify things, you can apply to anything. I believe. Maybe I'm too optimistic.
No, I like that perspective. There's a stigma associated with work, and maybe we've been doing it wrong, and work's not as bad as we portray it. It's a matter of reframing it in kind of a new and a better light as games and something we want to do and having a positive impact and positive externalities in the world.
Yeah, one thing that's really interesting is that the design space here is really huge. And so we're not necessarily modeling the current business structures. We're finding new ones. And that's really what Web3 is all about. So these tools help that happen.
Awesome. Yep. Okay, so we have 3 minutes left, and I intend to use every second of it. How about we go around and do a personal kind of shill for a minute? Deacon, DAO House V3 has just announced at ETH Denver. Maybe I describe this as a batteries included DAO framework. You want to give a holler on what that's about, why people should check it out?
Yeah. So yeah, V3 just launched. We're using new smart contracts that are a little more flexible. It has kind of all the Moloch things that we love from the past, like rage quit and shares and loot. It also has a lot of other flexibilities. So there's really a lot you can do with it. The V3 front end framework we built, this time we focused on the developer experience with the idea that, every DAO has their own kind of needs and, doing different experiments. And so you can't really build like one app to rule them all. You got to let people get in there and start tweaking and building things the way they want. You can build much more customized experiences along the way, like on the things like onboarding or voting or delegation or exit. So it's really exciting to start seeing some of the community and builders coming in and releasing some of these really cool new DAO kind of experiences. And they're coming out already. It's really cool. We've also started a public house, which is our kind of permissionless DAO to help manage the protocol. Right now it's managing the smart contracts and the kind of maintenance treasury for DAO House. So check out our webpage at daohouse.club. It's got a fresh new look by Vin Gist. It's very kind of glitchy architecture. I don't know. It's interesting. It's worth checking out. But thanks for the moment to chill.
Awesome. And next up, Machinations. You guys have kind of an audit kind of program. Could a DAO who wants to kind of have their economy modeled and verified, would this be something that they could leverage, or are you guys cooking something else for DAOs in the background?
Nicolas, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, we were more intensively working on Web3 projects last year, but yeah, I think we keep also doing audit. I mean, right now I'm doing an audit process on a Web3 game. Yeah, we are just about to finish it. I mean, it takes a lot of time because we have to analyze their white papers or their GED, their game design documents, and at the same time we have a lot of back and forth, a lot of meetings to understand their projects, their how they analyze their token, their token strategy, how they are engineered this whole reward system, because each one has different requirements, and depending on that we also we define a risk assessment framework, trying to see how the game can actually, and how the interactions between players and investors and them classified in different personas can affect the actual the ecosystem, analyzing things like token circulating supply, pools, and everything. We assess if they are, and we try to predict if there are going to be any risks that can be mitigated by the developers. So yeah, we're currently working on that, and I hope we can work even more, and we can create at least a framework that helps everyone, because it's a thing. I mean, it's rather new, and there's never been something like, I think, in my opinion, like analyzing the economy and modeling it and making predictions. And so it's kind of hard, because sometimes it's like walking it's like in the dark, but yeah, I guess it's a very good thing. We are learning along with every new project that we have. It's very good.
Amazing. Thank you. Do Kwon should have called you guys up, so don't be that guy, right? Okay. Rabbit, you have Curious Rabbit Consulting, which rolls right off the tongue. Tell us about that.
So I actually have a new name
Ooh, tell us.
because I don't know if I should tell you yet, because we have to trademark some stuff.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, I'll tell you in private.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, because I brought on a lawyer as my business partner and stuff, and because when you work in this field, there's so many regulatory concerns. Even just accepting tokens as payments, as a legal entity in the United States, is tricky. So there's a bunch of things to consider. So that's why I brought on a lawyer as my partner. And what we do is we pretty much help projects either design their tokens and their token system, audit their token system. We also provide and partner with others to provide these data dashboards that analyzes on-chain metrics related to your project and provides you with either a private or public dashboard of key metrics and things that you might be interested in. The future vision for that kind of product is actually some sort of ongoing monitoring, analysis, and policy changes suggestion, because we don't see token systems as being stagnant. We see them rather as being adaptive and probably changing and evolving over time, especially as new DeFi primitives come out that might help us leverage, or that we might leverage to help us change or manipulate the supply and demand dynamics of our tokens. Because at the end of the day, one of the core features of tokens is going to be their interoperability. And that means that as more and more applications are built for which you can use your token, effectively your token becomes more useful. So yeah, we help companies design their systems and think about these things and try to project into the future and see whether or not what they're designing is sustainable.
Awesome. Thank you for that plug. And last but not least, I'll plug what I'm working on. Polygon Village is going live in the next couple weeks, and as I alluded to, we're going to be kind of helping these early stage projects get more organized at an earlier stage of what is your governance? What's your plan for progressive decentralization? Do you have a business model? And kind of if you are a public good, then what's your plan for self-sustainability? To kind of come in with the scars that we've had over the few years of working in DAOs and kind of help them maybe dodge some of those potholes, right? So definitely keep an eye on my Twitter account, on my mirroroperator.mirror.xyz to see updates of that. And then you should see a post either today or tomorrow on a new post called a DAC Manifesto, Decentralized Autonomous Company Manifesto. So I want to thank everybody for listening in. I want to be respectful of the time. We're 7 minutes over. I'm geeked for this. This is indeed a new kind of science. I love everything that everyone's brought up and what we're building together. And please, anyone who wants to go deeper on this, feel free. Please follow everyone who's on this call and stay tuned. And if you want to contribute, feel free to dig into resources that different people share. Especially Rabbit has constant tutorials and stuff coming out on LinkedIn and Twitter. And then the DAO House crew jump in their Discord, and it's deep waters for sure. So thanks, everybody, and appreciate you being part of this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Justice. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
We'll see you.